Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Americans for Peace Now webinar. I'm Ori Nir. With me is Hadar Suskin, APN's president and CEO. And our guest today is our friend, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin. I apologize for the barking in the background. My dog is particularly annoyed today. Before we say hello to Dahlia and introduce her and start a conversation with her, I'd like to make three today comments. So the first two you're pretty familiar with. This webinar is recorded. The video will be on our YouTube channel sometime tomorrow, probably, and the audio on our podcast, Peacecast, sometime later today. The second one is that you are welcome to ask questions. You can start doing that as of now. Please use the Q&A code that's on the bottom of your screen, and please keep your questions short because we read them as we go along. The third comment is that we will have a discount code for you if you would like to purchase Dahlia's book, which we will discuss in today's webinar. And what we'll do is we will post the code in the post-webinar post on our website. I use post for 3 times in one sentence. And so it'll appear there after the webinar, and you can go there and get the discount code, which will give you a 30% discount on the book. Dr. Scheindlin, Dahlia, our friend, is a scholar and writer. She's an international political strategist and a consultant. She's advised and conducted research on 9 national campaigns in Israel over the past 20 years. And she's also provided research and advising for elections, referendums, and civil society campaigns around the world in many different countries. In her work, Dahlia takes the democracy pulse of various countries. And in this new book, she examines Israel's democracy. It's a complex analysis, and we invited Dahlia to discuss these complexities on our webinar today. Dahlia's book is titled Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled. You can already learn quite a lot from the title. It alludes to a famous Immanuel Kant quote, out of crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. And Kant's theory is that humans are fundamentally broken, but that our life's purpose is to confront the brokenness and build a better, stronger character, which is a hopeful attitude. It implies that repair is possible. And indeed, in the book, Dahlia proposes principles for repairing the broken timber that Israeli democracy is. We will discuss the ailments and the remedies that Dahlia proposes for Israeli democracy, and talk about what is unique about Israel's democracy and what is not so unique. So with that, hi, Dahlia. Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to hand it to Hadar to continue the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ori. And again, hello, Dahlia. Nice to see you. As Ori is reading through your impressive list of credentials, all I could think about is that I hope you are advising on another Israeli political campaign in the very near future. We'll see.
Why would you wish that upon someone you love?
Well, because, we need a campaign soon. And obviously, people are going to need your advice. But with that, I am really excited to have you with us today and to talk about this piece of work that I know just encapsulates so much of what you have done for years now, and your deep expertise on Israeli democracy in particular, but really drawing from your broader expertise engaging in this work in so many different countries. And people did not come here today to hear me talk about your work. They came to hear you talk about your work. So I am going to stop and hand it to you and say, thank you, welcome, take it away.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you to everybody who's attending. It's always nice to be in a conversation with old friends. In terms of what to talk about, just to present the book a little bit, I think that there are, I don't want to give a whole summary of the book because that would be boring, but I do want to talk about one of the main questions that I get, which is, how did you know to write this book? How did you have such foresight to write a book that would come out now when Israel is in such a devastating crisis over its democracy? And the answer is that I had no foresight. I am not a prescient person. I'm not a fortune teller. I was reporting, I was trying to put together lots of analysis that had been gathering in my mind and in my research and in my writing for about a decade, I would say. And that's because I have been concerned about the fate of Israeli democracy, or democracy in Israel, as I came to call the book, for a number of years. And I would say there were always concerns for me about about the fate of democracy in Israel in general. I had been working on issues of peace and conflict and the occupation really since I moved to Israel. I might as well mention that I moved here where I am now in Tel Aviv. I moved here in 1997, so it's been 26 years now. I would say there was never a time when the issue of democracy wasn't of concern to me, but it was particularly in the late 2000s and even more so in the early 2010s that I began becoming very disturbed by what I saw as a trend of attacks on Israeli institutions, and specifically attacks on the judiciary or judicial figures or the Supreme Court. Now, I began following those with increasing alarm over the course of the decade, and it took various forms. And I was writing about it. And finally, I thought, I've got to put all of the pieces together and write a report. And I did. I wrote a long report specifically on the attacks of the judiciary in 2021, building on ideas and observations and other, smaller articles that I had written for let's say, the last couple of years before that. And the reason why this is important is because I published that article it seems to me just a few weeks or maybe a month or two after a new government was established. We called it the change government. It was the first time Netanyahu had not been in power since 2009. And the big question on my mind, which wasn't a major feature in the political campaigns, but a lot of people were talking about it, was the attack on the judiciary. And I thought, is this government going to do something different? Is this government going to move away from that? It did contain parties that were breakaway parties from Likud, from Netanyahu's Likud. And in fact, the leader of that party at the time, Gideon Sa'ar, became justice minister. And I thought, well, I'm writing this big report on the attacks on the judiciary, but maybe this is all kind of a historic record. Maybe the issue isn't going to be that relevant anymore because this attack on the judiciary will now stop. But I wasn't sure, because who knew what the change government would do? It was an amazing year of the change government in which there were simply, for a long time, not the whole year, but for a long time, there just weren't big headlines in general about political scandals, about corruption, and what sounded like a cacophony of attacks on the Israeli judiciary. These themes that we'd been hearing for years about how the judiciary is, to sum it up, an enemy of the people, that the justices are against the people, against Judaism, trampling the will of the people, an unelected elite who can't win at the ballot box. All of that suddenly went quiet. I mean, we didn't see raging op-eds in Israeli right-wing papers or in Israel Hayom, the free daily paper originally founded and funded by Sheldon Adelson, which is essentially considered a pro-Netanyahu paper. There were op-eds, there were political commentators and political leaders who were making these kinds of statements all the time. And suddenly, it just seemed like it went quiet. And I thought, well, good, I got the report out. I summarized the last, decade or so of what I saw as a dangerous attack, but maybe now it's over. Well, of course, it wasn't over. It came roaring back with the new government, but I had already gotten the idea to write a book putting all of this together. And the reason why I decided to go beyond a single, researched policy report was because when I was doing that research, trying to go deeper into the sources of these attacks and what I saw as vulnerabilities of Israel's democratic institutions, and it does have democratic institutions, I kept having to go further back in time. At first I thought it started with Netanyahu coming back to power in 2009 and a kind of populist wave, an illiberal populist wave that began, we began seeing in other countries, which is something that you mentioned already, that there are some things that are not unique about this. But then I realized that the reason why there was such receptiveness to these messages was because of a deep uncertainty around a change that had taken place in Israel's constitutional order in a way in the 1990s, in which Israel took a more liberal turn in certain ways, and partly because the Supreme Court became more activist in ruling on the basis of human rights and democratic principles and equality. And it did so based on Israel's basic laws that were passed in 1992 and amended again in 1994. And that became a bit of a sea change. And I thought, well, there's a big argument about that, and I have to write about that to explain why we are here now. But then I realized the sources of that go back to the fact that Israel didn't have any constitutional level law or any laws grounding what we consider to be a basic Bill of Rights. Why don't we? Well, not for lack of trying, but I had to go back to the fact that there's no constitution. I had to go back to efforts to write a Bill of Rights over the years and pass one, which always failed. I had to go back to the interest groups that either torpedoed these attempts or other interest groups who were pushing for such things. And these took me back not only to ultimately, when I got the idea to write the book, I thought, okay, there is a story here of such complexity that it's frankly a good story. There have been ups, there's been downs, there have been struggles, there have been political dramas, all kind of characterizing how we got to where we are with Israeli democracy. It goes back to the start of statehood. So I got the idea to write a whole book about it. But then I thought, you can't really write a whole book about this without going back to the pre-statehood years. And so I had to go even further back, and I decided to go all the way back to early Zionism and the ideologies that led to the establishment of the state and how they thought about democracy. I guess the final word I'll say about the book is that in some ways it is a history, right? It's a history of Israel through the lens of democracy. But I've tried to write it in a way that I'm telling, every history is a selection. We can't tell every historical detail about the world. I've tried to shape and select and present the historical developments. Some of them are well known, some of them are a little less known, some of them I didn't know until I was working on this, in ways that I think make the case about where democracy in Israel was at that time. And I tried to explain along the way in the different sections and the different chapters what we should understand from these historical events in terms of what they mean for the trajectory of democracy. Which aspects were getting better, which aspects were getting worse, which aspects remained unresolved. And these are, all these different threads. And of course, democracy has many indicators. What do we mean when we talk about democracy? So I had to look at all of those as best I could, although it's not a democracy index. I'm not quantifying this. I refer to democracy indices. I thought I could try to bring this all together as a story. It's a complicated story, and I know sometimes people prefer simple stories, to quote a famous Israeli author, but I don't think it can be a simple story, and that's why I thought it was interesting. But then, as I was finishing the book, this new government was established, and all of the processes I had in mind. Well, let me just put it this way: I thought, well, maybe I really will need to revise, themes of the book. But the more I saw what was going on, I could only see them as a coming to fruition, as a natural extension, a very extreme extension of the things that I had been, observing over the last decade. And so I had to frantically try to keep updated with events without getting stuck in the trap of fixating on things that look big today but aren't big tomorrow. Of course, that's always a dilemma. But I actually, and I hope this is not me just being, self-congratulatory, I did not think I needed to revise the analysis of the book because the history didn't change. And I think that the perspective that I took away at least helped me for understanding where we are now. And so I certainly hope it helps readers who I hope will read it.
Thank you. I just was sort of smiling at when you were talking about, going back a little further and then feeling the need to go back a little further and to the establishment of the state and to pre-state. I mean, obviously, anyone who engages in the sort of ongoing discourse around Israel and Palestine, I think finds...
Sorry, I lost sound.
Uh-oh. It's not me, is it? Or
give me 1 second.
Okay. Small technical issue. Apologies. No problem.
Okay.
Let us know. Yeah, okay, great. Thanks.
Great.
I'm back. Sorry.
Okay. No problem. I'm just saying, it was fascinating to hear you talk about going back because anyone who engages in the ongoing discourse around Israel, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli-Arab, knows that, on any topic in any conversation, you can say, well, this thing, and then somebody else is going to say, but if you go back to 73, you have that. Yes, but in 48, there was this. But in 222 BC, so I feel like you could take this back to the beginnings of time, frankly. But, to catch us up from 222 BC to today, I think it must have been fascinating for you to watch this year happen as you were trying to finish this book. And like you were saying, it's the coming to fruition of many of these events. But this year has been different in some ways. And we've seen hundreds of thousands of Israelis coming out in the street, fighting against the judicial coup And for many of them, it seems like the messaging is like, okay, if we can just stop this thing, then we can go back to what was our wonderful democracy, and everything was great in that. I think the question I have there is, how, without it being an index, without rating, I mean, how much do you feel like Israel really was a democracy before January 4th, before the beginning of the judicial coup?
Yeah. Well, this is the, the sort of $64 million question. I think even after writing a whole book and thinking very, very deeply about it, I haven't come up with one good adjective to modify the word democracy in terms of, whether it's a healthy democracy, a flawed democracy, a this kind or that kind. But I did collect a lot of other people's adjectives, and there's an interesting list to be had. I don't think that's the way to put it, because all of those concepts convey that Israel essentially is a democracy with an adjective. And I don't really see it that way. Let me try to explain how I came to see it. I came to see it as a country that has, or at least had, but still has for the most part, robust democratic institutions. I think that's an empirical reality, and no Israeli or even Palestinian would dispute that. It has robust democratic institutions. It has particularly a thriving electoral tradition, often on overdrive. It has fairly representative governance of those who vote, and those who are able to vote. It has, mostly, with some limitations, free press and free speech and civil society. The thing is that those aspects apply to only some of the people that Israel controls, and we have to admit at this point that Israel controls them permanently. If anybody can foresee a situation in which Israel doesn't effectively control Palestinians, I'd be, open to hearing it, but I don't see it. And it has been 56 years. And so, the question of when we describe Israel as a democracy or not always kind of flounders on the issue of borders and citizens and non-citizens. And that is certainly an underlying theme and quite explicit theme of the book, that we have to include everybody, even though I don't think that was necessarily the case in 1967, but we have to include everybody at this point. So, as Israeli citizens know, I think, Israeli citizens are now learning that even if you could certainly argue that there are robust liberal democratic institutions for the citizens of Israel, one thing Israeli citizens are now realizing is that the foundation of those institutions and those protections and those rights that citizens enjoy to have representative government and civil rights and freedoms was very flimsy, okay? And that even the rights of citizens in this some kind of democracy, or again, I'd rather not use the term adjective plus democracy, that even the rights of citizens are not so well protected. And I think that a lot of people are expressing shock that what they consider to be the democratic fabric of Israel could be undermined in their impression overnight, because Israel has normalized situations that are not democratic, practices that are not democratic over the course of its entire history. And it did not start in 1967. That's another thing I think that really needs to be said. And I do make this case in the book, that even before the occupation, for the first 20 years roughly of Israeli independence, Israel was committing even more undemocratic practice, because it enacted a military regime, military government, holding civilians under colonial laws that were simply carried over from the colonial era, of its own citizens. And so, the evolution of the military government took different forms as well. But the fact is, those citizens had nothing like democracy, except for the nominal aspect that they were given universal suffrage. Everybody was allowed to vote. But again, when you're voting in a situation where you don't have the kinds of civil rights needed to make your free choice meaningful, then I would say, this concept of electoral democracy to me is unfair to the word democracy. And I don't think it counts. It's not that I would say it doesn't matter at all, because there were Arab political parties. Palestinian citizens were able to vote, which is something. But it's not the same as saying they lived in a democratic society. And in no other way did they have the kinds of democratic, again, rights and protections and representation. So what I'm saying is not just to, say that's bad. It is bad, but that's not my point. My point is that Israelis came to understand our society is democratic. Israelis see their own society as democratic in a way that incorporates this very undemocratic practice and institutions. And of course, that continued after 67. It never really stopped, because the military government formally ended in December 1966, but the colonial emergency laws were still applied to those citizens, phasing out only through 1968, by which time Israel, of course, had already begun another martial law, military administration, which is actually a hodgepodge of layers of law, many of them carried over again from colonial era on the Palestinians. And so Israelis have normalized that as well. Citizens participate in the army. This is a people's army. And all of that is considered part of what it means for Israelis to say we are a democratic country, which is why, in my opinion, they haven't really understood what democracy is and why the threats were ongoing for so long, leading us to this point. And that's why Israelis are shocked by what's happening, I think.
It is. It's one of the most interesting pieces I think we've seen this year is Jewish Israeli citizens, sort of this eye-opening to, first of all, paying attention to the occupation, but even, as you were saying, beyond the occupation, looking at the thin nature of their democracy. And you're right, people fall back on, oh, look, we just had 4 elections. Of course, we're a democracy. And the electoral piece is essential, but it's not sufficient.
I would say it's not nearly as meaningful when you don't have full and equal rights, civil rights, human rights, individual rights, and the institutions that protect them. Declaring rights is one thing. You have to be able to implement them in society, protect them through the institutions where people can argue their conflicts and demand their rights. So yeah, I mean, I know that this is, a very complicated issue. And one thing I do try to do in the book, we'll see how successfully, is I try my best to situate Israel's history in the understandings of democracy at the time. In other words, I'm fully aware that in the early 20th century, when policymakers and statesmen talked about democracy, and I can say statesmen, men at that time, they were talking about majority rule, or they were talking about elections, and that's it. But those concepts changed over time, and they changed, early enough for Israel to know what liberal democracy was, even without using the term. How do we know that? Because it's written right there in UN Resolution 181. UN Resolution 181 isn't only the partition plan. It also calls for the 2 states to be established according to an elected authorities to establish constitutions, and and they spell out the kinds of rights that were supposed to be in those constitutions, and it is nothing other than what we would call today a liberal democracy. So, from that time on, even as I wouldn't go so far as to say every other democracy was a perfect liberal democracy. Not at all. Switzerland didn't even have full suffrage until 1971. But anyway, so I think that we have to understand, and of course, not to even speak of America. People often say to me, but if you're so critical of the Israeli, democratic history, what about other countries? Absolutely. I would be equally critical of other countries. I try to, I do, again, try to situate this in the global context, but it's not a straightforward comparison of Israel to the US or Israel to any other country. But I think these critiques absolutely can be applied elsewhere.
That in the book's conclusion, you write that you'd been thinking of appropriate metaphors for democracy. I like that passage because it's a little more playful than the overall academic tone of the book. One of those metaphors is that democracy is like a pet that the children love in the household, but the adults keep on a leash to prevent it from entering important rooms in the house that they don't want the pet to go into. So in the case of Israeli democracy, which rooms, except the occupation, which you've already mentioned, are no-go areas for democracy? In other words, what are the elements that hinder Israeli democracy?
Yeah. First of all, I really appreciate that you picked up on that, and I take umbrage at the fact that you said it's an academic tone, even though I'm just kidding. It is there's lots of footnotes, and in any case, but I did use the conclusion to try to be a little more conversational, and it's tricky because for the entire time of working on this, I thought how to convey the image of democracy. And yes, the idea of that it's a pet that people love and cherish, I will talk about that afterwards. But yes, I had this image of, the children love this pet and they nurture, and the whole family kind of loves the pet, and they feed it and nurture it and let it wander all over the house, and they're very friendly to it. But there are certain moments when the pet comes up to a room and the door is just slammed shut in their face. So, for example, in the early years, of course, democracy had nothing to do with the Arab community. The Arab, you couldn't talk about. I mean, the idea, other than elections, that Arabs had, the right to equality even as citizens was just irrelevant almost. The kinds of, let me be clear about what I mean by this. Living under, military regime, under colonial legislation, means they had no civil rights or protections. They had courts, but they were military courts. There was no appeal in the military courts. This was all justified by security, right? Because they were, we can all understand that this was immediately after the War of Independence, but even political leaders at the time had long since thought that it was not really for security purposes, that the same kind of security could be had through civilian authority. Most of them saw it, many political leaders, certainly opposition to Mapai, began to see it as a sort of political machinery for keeping control. It was largely about ensuring that the Jewish population established its dominance. It was largely about affecting land and property appropriation, which was also done through regular legislation, okay, in ways that allowed the government to simply take their land and property. And of course, they had no civil rights by which to challenge these things. And so it's like the grown-ups say, it's our responsibility to make sure this is a Jewish and Jewish-dominated state, and the sentimentalists can worry about democracy. But again, there's one party that was not sentimentalist about it at all, and that was Cherut, who was against the military government. Okay, Jabotinsky's the party that expressed the revisionist movement established by Jabotinsky, the forerunner of Likud. They were absolutely opposed to the military government at a certain point within a few years because they saw it as a matter of political machinery established by the government in order to be, funnel people into government support and establish satellite parties that would help keep Mapai elected. So there was that, but that's not a democratic position either. It wasn't exactly for support of democratic principles. So for Arab, Palestinian citizens in the early part of the state, democracy was not allowed in. Security issues almost always trump democracy or democratic values or human rights or things like transparency. And I'm thinking about the fact that in the early years, one example I give in the book is that the Internal Security Agency was not even, its existence was not admitted or known until after the Kastner affair in 1956. So in the earliest years, they denied its existence. There was no law governing the Internal Security Agency until 2002. And therefore, all sorts of abuses were made, including political use of the internal security agencies to do surveillance on political opponents, of course, on the entire Arab community, which, controlling them through the military regime largely relied on surveillance, through the internal security agencies. And then I give the example again. I go through one very well-known episode of the bus number 300 affair when, some of this stuff really came to light and the Shabak practices were exposed, and this led to a whole reckoning. But these are the kinds of things that make us realize just how lawless and unrules governed the practices of the security establishment was, the security apparatuses was in Israel. And I think that even to this day, we are mostly willing to sacrifice democratic principles for things like security. And of course, democracy is not allowed to touch the issues. Democracy, in the sense of protections for individuals, equality, gender equality, et cetera, it was not allowed anywhere near the topic of religion and state. Okay, the relations with the religious parties are one of the reasons Israel doesn't have a constitution. Not the only reason, I should say, but certainly part of it. And things like this, the fact that the state obliges certain citizens and not others to perform military service, give the state its due, give years of their lives and sometimes their lives, is an unequal, a completely unequal practice because of people's personal beliefs, religion or not religion, religious or not religious. That's a violation of equality. We've seen it many times over. The Supreme Court has ruled on that, but we didn't have a constitution to guarantee that. We don't have any laws guaranteeing the equality of all citizens. And the reason why we don't have equality in our basic laws today is largely because the religious parties have opposed it at every step. So democracy, as I understand it in the richer sense, was not allowed into the room of religion and state. Of course, we talked about occupation. And again, I think that the metaphor came to me, or the image came to me, because the country sees itself as cherishing this idea that we are democratic and really quite genuinely wants to nurture that. But if you get too supportive of democratic values, if you take democracy into those rooms where it doesn't belong, in the past, we got called sentimentalists, bleeding hearts, yafei nefesh. Nowadays, people like that are considered hypocritical, anti-Israel, traitors, or if you listen to the prime minister this week, they are considered PLO and Iran collaborators.
Which was a very, very strange set of things to accuse Israeli protesters of, but it's not the last time, I'm sure. Thank you for that, Dahlia. I just want to note, Ori just put in the chat, but for those of you who perhaps aren't following that, I remind you that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom to ask questions. And I am, in fact, going to build off of one of those questions that's been submitted, Dahlia, to ask you the next thing that is, I think, for many people, certainly in the American Jewish and American political conversation, when we talk about Israel, the phrase that is used constantly is Jewish and democratic. That is the framework of from what you hear people chatting about in synagogues or wherever else up to the president of the United States. And it's also, been a litmus test for sort of legitimacy in Israel for political parties. You were getting to this. You were talking about those rooms, and you were talking about issues of religion. There are now, I think, more and more people who are saying that very framework that for so long has been embraced by many people, saying, yes, Israel is going to be Jewish and democratic, in and of itself is not democratic, because it is favoring the Jewish. Yeah. Tell me, how do you feel about that? What do you think? Do you see that? How do you see that tension playing out in what's happening now?
Yeah. Well, one thing, it's, we should clarify, it's not a litmus test. It's actually written into Israel's basic laws. It was written into Israel's basic laws in 1985 in the famous Clause 7A of the Basic Law of the Knesset, which is part of our electoral law. In order to be able, that says that a party cannot stand for elections if it undermines or violates the Jewish and democratic nature of Israel. That's been amended slightly over time in a certain way, but that's a little bit too detailed for now. But the point is that was passed in order to be able to ban essentially the Kach party, Meir Kahana's Jewish supremacist Kach party. And so there is, it's not just an ethos or a spirit, it is actually there in our laws. In truth, I think that there's a whole wide range of policies and laws that may not explicitly say Jewish or democratic or Jewish or Arab, but that have affected, again, the privileged position of Jews over the years long before 1985. Like I mentioned before, the policies and laws that were used to, for the state to appropriate, for example, many properties of Arabs, and distinctions between who can immigrate to Israel, etc. But let's just go back to this. I mean, the electoral law basically means that a party that one could argue negates or violates or threatens the Jewish and democratic character of Israel can't stand for election. So, the Central Election Committee is often bans parties that they claim violate that. Now, the Supreme Court usually overturns those, but there is a de facto chilling effect. Okay, so even in our most democratic institution, the electoral institution, this is a very real concept. You can't be a party that supports a binational state. You can, it's even dicey whether you can say you're a party that supports a state for all its citizens. Something that, amazingly, when you go to other countries who really aren't obsessed with Israel, they don't even understand the dispute over the question of a state of all its citizens in a democracy. It's confusing to them. But many parties just won't say that because they know they could be challenged. Okay, so that's just an example of how I think this really permeates way beyond the matter of a litmus test. By the way, this is the great thing about kind of doing historical, excavations. One of an early reader who was giving me comments on the book said, was reading about my treatment of this issue and said, when was the first time the Jewish and democratic phrasing was used? And I had a hard time answering it because, of course, it's not in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence talks a great deal about how Israel is the fulfillment of the self-determination for the Jewish people. There's a lot of history of the Jewish people. In fact, I would think from one article that I read, I think it's about 2/3, and it seems right if you actually read the Declaration of Independence. Much more of it is about Jewish history than about the nature of the new state.
And the word democracy does not appear.
The word democracy does not appear in it, and there's a reason for that. Now, scholars will point out, and political scientists, that it contains all the features establishing democratic institutions, in Israel. It calls for elections. It calls for elections for a constituent assembly that is supposed to write a constitution. It has the famous paragraph establishing the equality of all citizens, regardless of, race, creed, or sex, etc. So we have the principles of democracy. But the reason why it's important that the word democracy isn't there is because it was taken out. It was consciously taken out of the various drafts that were going around in the very hectic few weeks in which the declaration was written, during the very hectic decision made, in kind of accelerated fashion, that this is the moment to declare statehood. So I think that is the important point. There was like some sort of, we want to establish that this is a democracy, or maybe we want to fulfill the expectations of the international community. We want to fulfill the obligations of UN Resolution 181 that will give us our international legitimacy. There were leaders who thought that Israel must have that in order to be accepted into the UN, but we won't say the word why. If all the practice and institutions are laid out, to my mind, there's no reason why, except for a preference to avoid an explicit commitment to that. That's the democratic side of it. As for the Jewish side of it, and by the way, the answer to the question, that the only one that I could come up with, where you find Jewish and democratic as a formula, certainly in Israeli, official documents, is the 1985 Basic Law. Maybe the term was used before then informally. But whether or not I think Israel can be Jewish and democratic, I really think that the answer is very obvious. It's only a matter of how you define Jewish. What does it mean to have a Jewish state? The way it's been defined up until now is in a way that institutionally and legally privileges Jews above all others, especially if this was subject to debate before. It is no longer subject to debate after the passing the nation state law, which establishes that Israel is the place of exclusive right of self-determination for the Jewish people, which means that 25% of the population who is not Jewish does not have the right to self-determination. And so, and lowering the status of the Arabic language, et cetera. But again, I think that we can, at least I think that it's empirically, indisputable that there were plenty of practices and laws that effectively did already privilege Jews above all else before the nation state law. So if it's going to be defined in that way, and not to even mention the imposition of Jewish religious, dictates in some way, certain practices and religious restrictions on public life and private life, because of course religious authorities have the authority over family law in Israel. In that sense, no, it really can't be Jewish and fully democratic. But I also don't think it necessarily that's the only interpretation of what it means to be Jewish in a political context. You can have a much more minimalist and symbolic definition of Jewish. You could have Jewish in ways that reflect the culture, but also are not exclusive of other cultures. And you would eventually have to rethink all legislation that in practice discriminates against non-Jews. And that's where it gets very thorny, because the main legislation, I think the most important and long-standing one, is the law of return. Should Jews who have never had any connection by birth to this region have advantages and preference for immigration over people who can claim direct family lineage to this region? That is a significant aspect of the kinds of Jewish state contradicting certain elements of democracy. It's a little bit, probably opens up big legal issues and policies of states, but these are the kinds of things you really have to rethink. But ultimately in the end, I make what even I consider to be a controversial analysis for myself. I'm still conflicted about it, which is that I think that the argument of the right wing when Israel was passing the nation state law is, why are we being held to a different standard? Germany's constitution says that it's the country of the German people, and many constitutions say that Spain is the country of the Spanish people, et cetera. Well, the fact is that in some countries, citizenship completely overlaps with nation. So if you become a German citizen, you are included as an equal in the family of citizens. And in Spain, there are elements of their constitution that significantly recognize their national minorities, give them lots of national recognition, and talk about affirmative policies to try to make ensure the equality of these national groups. Of course, it didn't necessarily help. They have a separatist problem. But there are ways to do this that convey, we acknowledge the Jewish national identity, but we are committed to the equality of all citizens, including recognizing that there are national minorities here who are nations and have equal rights in the body politic. And in that sense, I don't think it's impossible, and I think it's even legitimate, because the Jewish people are a nation. I don't expect them to give up on their national identity, just the way I don't expect any other people to give up on their national identity.
Yeah, I think what you said about it being a question, being able to be Jewish and democratic being a question about how you define Jewish, I feel like in so many ways up until now in Israeli history, people have looked at it and said, well, it depends how you define democratic. Right, that they led.
I don't have any problem with how to define democratic.
Yeah, well, I know, but I'm not talking about you.
I know.
Led with the Jewish, and they've said, well, as you were saying, Israeli citizens believe deeply in their heart of hearts that Israel is a democracy, and it is in certain senses, and yet that's been narrowed by definition in many different examples in many different places. Or
there's a great line. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dahlia.
No, I was just going to clarify that democracy is, a political system. It's a system of organizing modern states in the post-war world. A religion or even nation is not a political organizational system. And so by definition, it has a lot more flexibility. There's no rules for how to do it. There's no agreement for how to implement your national identity. So that has to be subordinate to the political system governing the state. And if you want that system to be a democracy, you have to subordinate the national and certainly the religious identity to democracy. It doesn't mean you have to erase it altogether.
Yeah.
There's a great line by Knesset member Ahmed Tibi, who's known for his sharp tongue, who says, yes, Israel is Jewish and democratic. It's democratic toward the Jews and Jewish toward the Arabs, which I think is a kind of smart way of putting it. I wanted to go back to the occupation.
You're not going to let me respond to that?
Respond to it. Sure,
Yes.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Israel is not sufficiently democratic for Jews. And it was particularly not sufficiently democratic for Jews in its least democratic era, which was between 1948 and, let's say sometime in the 1960s and 70s. But we can, give that marker as, for example, the transition of power in 1977. But without a constitution and, without a commitment to democratic values, it's never going to be sufficiently democratic for Jews either. So I love Ahmed Tibi's line. I use it. We all used it for a long time. But I think now we should probably amend it.
Okay, going back to the occupation, and the reason is that we've got quite a few questions that relate to it in several ways. And you point out in the book that the occupation is a major hindrance, if not the major hindrance, to democracy in Israel. But I'm going to ask you this question in a kind of a challenging way. Look, the territories under occupation are not Israel. And people could say, the nature of military occupation is that it's not democratic. That's what it is. Israel holds the occupied territories pending a political settlement with the Palestinians. Why can't there be a democracy in Israel? And why can't there be a debate on the nature of democracy in Israel inside the Green Line, regardless of what's happening across the Green Line?
Okay. So I think the first part of this answer is that Israel doesn't stop at the Green Line. In other words, the Green Line is completely irrelevant. It has become irrelevant. There are 500,000 Israelis living in the West Bank alone, not to mention, if we're talking about the Green Line, we have to include 250,000 Israelis living in East Jerusalem. So we're talking, over probably 650 to 680,000 Israelis living across the Green Line. But as much as the Green Line has been erased and it is impossible to draw a geographic border around what counts as Israel now, I would argue, and I try to argue in the book, and I do hope this comes through, that there is no institutional border between the state of Israel, the civilian state of Israel, and the occupation, which is supposed to be a military regime. And there has been a kind of ongoing fiction that we're talking about two separate regimes. The occupation is an institutional appendage of some sort that if we need to, one day we can amputate because it's not healthy for Israeli democracy, and the body would be basically healthy as a democracy if it weren't for this bad appendage. I think that the close look at the occupation from the beginning exposes that as completely wrong. And the reason why I say that is from the earliest years of the occupation, actually within months of the occupation beginning, you had the Israeli Knesset, the legislature, civilian legislature, passing legislation to place Israelis who are in the West Bank in occupied territory in Gaza as well, and the other parts that were occupied at the time, under Israeli criminal law. Israeli criminal law, not military law, even though everybody under occupied territory is supposed to be subject to military rule. So already from the very beginning, the Israeli legislature is involved. Very quickly, the Supreme Court begins hearing cases involving residents of the West Bank, Palestinians, sometimes Palestinians charging, in disputes with the army. And those cases are immediately heard in the Israeli judiciary, in the Supreme Court. And then, as we know, the Supreme Court has a long history of involvement. Not to mention, of course, the involvement of ministries. Now, of course, the defense ministry is involved because the army is doing this, but every other ministry was quickly involved right away. When Israel conquered those territories, it established interministerial committees, and the interministerial committees were responsible for developing all aspects of civilian life, which Israel did control all aspects of Palestinian civilian life. We have to remember, up until the Oslo Accords, basically, and it established various bodies for doing that. Of course, much of it was managed through the army, but it was the ministries that made the decisions about them, mostly governed from the very top, of course. but other ministries had to be involved. How do you build roads without the transportation ministry, et cetera? How do you manage the economy without Israel's economic, finance ministry being involved? How do you finance the whole project without Israel's finance ministry being involved? And of course, the obvious that, again, as I said before, Israel is a people's army. So every person could theoretically be involved. Not everybody serves in the occupied territories, but every civilian part of the executive branch, the Israeli governing ministries have been involved since the beginning, and the Israeli judiciary. And the legislature, that's every branch of government. Now, never mind that the laws that govern parts of the West, that govern Palestinians and Israeli Jews are complex and layered, but for the most part, everybody under occupied territory should be under military law, but Israel has in practice developed a completely separate system of laws for Israeli Jews that goes through either the legislature or military orders that essentially copy Israeli civilian law to make sure there's two different kinds of law. So there's this kind of meshing of Israeli civilian authorities with the army authorities. And I kept talking about it like lace, like you couldn't pull apart the strands of the civilian military interaction. But when I sent it to readers, they said, what do you mean? I understand. It's so complicated that I think that this was the hardest chapter to write. It's so complicated to explain because you really can't pick apart Israel and the occupation institutionally. It's not only a geographic border that has been erased. And so I think that we also have to keep the other side of this in mind. The other side of this is that the people, the actual personnel, Israel's public service, of course, the army, the people enacting undemocratic practice are undemocratic. In other words, they may enjoy the benefits and protections of democracy as citizens, but they are practicing undemocratic practices in implementing these policies, which are institutionally unequal. And so how can they be a democratic people or a democratic society? Democracy isn't just about enjoying the fruits. You have to try to behave and implement policies that are democratic as well. And if the country's policies are not democratic, then the institutions and the bureaucracies and the people in them are implementing undemocratic policies. And I came to conclude that that makes them, again, unaware or kind of normalizing undemocratic practice that the country does, as if that is what it means to live in a democratic country that just has a few flaws. Okay, but that's why we're all surprised now, because we had wrongful understandings of what democracy is.
So first of all, right. I mean, the slogan, that comes to mind for me there is, that we've seen many in the anti-occupation bloc using, that the occupation has occupied Israel, right? That these lack of democratic or these undemocratic processes have sort of come home to roost, and Jewish Israeli citizens are now noticing, which I agree with. But I have a question for you. I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with that analysis in terms of how Jewish Israelis have been treated in the occupied territories versus Palestinians, and the interweaving, or whatever language you wanted to use there, between the civilian and the military, and bringing another layer of illegitimacy to the occupation, which of course under international law is supposed to be only military, even if one considered it temporary. But the part that I want to follow up on is the question of what it would mean or not. Is it possible to separate from that? Because I understand, again, agree with your point saying Israel's institutions are interwoven with the occupation, yet still, if we, could get to a point where there was an Israeli government that was willing and able to end the occupation, would it not still bring an end to that? It would end that interwovenness along with the rest of the occupation, no?
Yeah, I think the only way to look at that through a democratic lens, and by the way, that's also part of what I was trying to do, is say, how do we look at the issue of the conflict and occupation, not necessarily from the lens of peacemaking, only because I despaired. I mean, I've been involved in peacemaking thinking for so long. And I thought, what if we look at it through the prism of democracy? What kinds of conclusions do we come to? And so I would say not terribly different conclusions, but we understand them maybe in a different way. If you look at this from the prism of democracy, there's only really two ways to think about it. One is that Israel exerts actual democratic rule only over a limited number of citizens without controlling anybody that it does not wish to give democratic rights to. And that would mean separating the populations, finding a way to separate them, whether it's, then you have to go through the territorial and boundary disputes. Or Israel says, whoever we control will be treated equally as they should be in a democratic society. So, I think, again, we reach similar conclusions. Of course, to my mind, the conclusion is more of a two states and a confederated approach, which I would love to, have the opportunity to talk about why I think that flows from this book, but it's not really part of the book. But I think that the basic principle is that sorry?
So that's the next book.
The next one, right. Actually, never mind. The point is, I think that, again, if you're looking at this through a democratic lens, the principle of citizenship is defining anybody who is a citizen, and I should include anybody who Israel permanently controls, right? Needs to have equal rights and protections. And if you want to call yourself a democracy, decide who's in and who's out. For the first 4 years of Israel's history, it did not have a citizenship law. Technically, nobody was a citizen. And there's a reason why it didn't have a citizenship law. Many drafts were proposed. Ben-Gurion didn't want them. And the understanding is that nobody wanted to really define a citizenship to include Arabs and to include equality of all citizens until they had passed the law of return and could make sure there were enough Jews so that once we define citizenship, it's very clear that still the Jews are, a firm majority, even though by the end of the Nakba, they were clearly a majority anyway. So that's another example of this, let's live in a murky zone with these weird technicalities just to avoid making decisions that we would have to make as a democratic society if we were to be a democratic society. And by the same logic, it's almost where we are now, right? Israel is controlling these populations without admitting that it's controlling them permanently, without admitting that they are, subjects ultimately of Israeli control, with a few local and civil affairs outsourced to an auxiliary force of the Palestinian Authority. And yet wants to find technical reasons not to treat them as equals. Well, decide where the borders are, decide who's in and out of the body politic, or extend democratic practice to all.
So I'm looking both at the clock and at the questions that we have from our attendees. And what I'm going to do is try to cobble together a couple of questions here. One is has to do with the nature of Israeli society, the society that is post-traumatic or maybe still in the throes of a trauma. The fact that people are afraid, does that impact their attitude toward democracy and the prospects of trying to improve Israeli democracy? And then another question that we have here is, and I'll just read it out, is if the present government were to fall tomorrow and a relatively moderate government were to win an election, what are the first steps that you would see as critical to instilling full democracy in Israel? So this goes to your suggested remedies, if you will.
So the first question is, to what extent does fear define something about the Israeli political culture?
Yes, or impact, or serve as a hindrance, perhaps, to being able to improve democracy in Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly is there, but I think that and this is one of the ways I don't think Israel is unique. Well, typically it's a contradiction. Israel is unique in terms of democratic countries because it's in an ongoing military conflict and has been essentially in military conflicts through its entire history. Since 1967, it's been involved in an active military occupation. And I think you can't really compare a society that has this as part of the body, if you're considering a biological metaphor for democracy, you really can't compare that to societies that are either not at war or not, committing these kinds of practices, because it warps, as I've tried to argue, it warps our understanding of what democracy is. And that's why Israel has, more vulnerable democracy and has refused to make some of the decisions and lay down some of the institutions you would have in a democracy, largely because of those reasons. Now, of course, at the psychological level, those kinds of conflicts also breed fear. And fear can be leveraged. And I have argued myself many times, based on polling, what I really do for my day job is public opinion research for political campaigns, that attitudes towards the conflict and Jewish Arab identity issues completely define the spectrum of left, right, and center. It's not about economy. It's not about big government. It's a little bit about conservative and liberal social values, but that's mostly because there's also a deep religious divide, which of course plays into the conflict-related divide. So any society that is constantly at war of some sort will have a strong fear factor, and not to mention that there are genuine security threats. I mean, I've lived through the Second Intifada. I've lived through the last year where there's, waves of terrible terror attacks that have killed civilians in Israel that Palestinians have perpetrated. These things are part of our reality. And so, of course, you can, fear is part of it. But I honestly think it goes way beyond fear, because there's never much of a change in people's political attitudes based on whether there's, this gets into longer public opinion trends. But when we are in a quieter phase, okay, when we're in a phase of less military escalation and not very many terror attacks, most Israelis basically conclude that if this is the case, we shouldn't change things. We shouldn't end the occupation for that reason, because things are quiet, so we're doing a good job, because they see things only through a security lens and an ideological lens. And then, of course, when there's escalations and violence, then it's every reason not to release Israel's grip. And I think that you really can't underestimate or ignore that there is a strong ideological factor, and all you need to do to know that is talk to right wingers, especially those who have a religious orientation. I'm not even judging it now. I'm just saying, to ignore their ideological commitment and their theological commitment to Israeli sovereignty, not just their presence, but Israeli sovereignty over all of the land from the river to the sea, is to completely deny who they are. I mean, it's burying their head in the sand. It's actually diminishing to them to pretend that this isn't an ideological thing, that it's only motivated by fear or security. Now, it's true there is a slice of the right wing that is mostly motivated by security, not so ideological, and would make concessions if they had security reassurances. But you know what? It's a smaller part of the right than the ideological part. And of course, there's not entirely a hard separation between them. So fear, and the other thing is that fear can be manipulated in any country, even if it's not in an active military conflict. Fear of immigration, fear of LGBTQ rights. I mean, these things are fear factors everywhere. This is why we see a rise in white nationalism in the US. So I think it's a little bit murky to pin it on fear. In terms of what a new and moderate government would do, well, I can look at my personal understanding of a moderate government, or I can look at the reality of the political parties today who consider themselves to be in the Democratic camp. And those include parties of the moderate right wing, or what Israelis see as the moderate right wing. And I think the first thing they would do is staunch the bleeding, because right now we're witnessing, an all systems attack on the one institutional check and balance on the power of the state. I mean, let me just, lay this out for anybody who doesn't really, who hasn't thought about it like this. Israel is really the only country if you're comparing to Western democratic countries, that does not have any institutional checks and balances on the power of the executive. The executive basically controls the legislature. We don't have direct elections for the executive, or the executive power. We don't have elections we don't have a bicameral Knesset. We don't have any regional representation. We don't have a constitution. We're not part of international courts or anything that establishes a grounding for human rights. So the only check and balance we have on the power of the executive in Israel is the independent judiciary and elections. And so right now, those are all in danger, including elections. And if you're not sure why, there's lots of reasons why I say even elections are in danger. I wrote an article about it maybe a month and a half ago or so in Haaretz. And there's very little question that this government, if it gets its way, will pass policies and legislation that undermine even the integrity, not so much through fraud, but through changes in the legal system that make elections less reflective of the citizens. And so, yes, first of all, any government would have to simply stop, roll back what this government is doing, cease the attack on the judiciary. I would say establish stronger roles for the judiciary. I would have them anchor judicial review in Israeli legislation, as the legislators wished to do in the 1980s when they were developing the basic laws that became these piecemeal laws for human rights. And they hoped to establish judicial review in a future basic law of legislation. So that's the kind of thing I would say needs to happen. But of course, there's more far-reaching things. But I think ending undemocratic practices one by one would be, the most fundamental start. The other thing I would say is that we need to think long-term. Democracies don't build, strengthen, or revive or emerge overnight. And I think that part of the problem here is that we, again, have had a self-education in democracy that was wrong. Okay, you don't have democracy that is implementing military government on citizens or non-citizens for 56 years. I think we have to have a real recommitment, rededication to the principles of democracy, and not just through street protests, but through long-term education, through the education system. It's one of my sadnesses about the book that I didn't have room to kind of add a whole theme of how much Israel devoted education hours to civics and democracy, more or less, in what form. I did touch on the principles of the aims of public education in Israel and how those evolved over time and were changed in the legislation over time. Very interesting. There's an amendment to the Israel's public education law in the year 2000 that looks like a perfect, almost the principles for a democratic constitution. It's an indicator of how Israel was taking advances, leaps, sort of incremental steps, but actually accelerated steps in the 1990s towards more liberal democratic principles. Those kinds of things have to be integral to society. You need a culture of buy-in for democracy and for the full understanding of democracy in order to have people who will commit themselves to it.
Dahlia, we have reached our time limit. I want to thank you. Thank you for joining us today and for this conversation. Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for all of the work. Again, we will share both on our website and in an email with everyone who registered the discount code to purchase the book for those of you who are interested. And also, when we go on our trip to the region next spring, I'm quite hopeful that we will be meeting with Dahlia again. So you guys should come with us, with Dahlia in person. So thank you again. Thank you, Ori. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We will
Before
see
we
you
end the
again
call,
soon.
can I ask for one request? I would love to see if there's a way to download the questions. I know I couldn't get to all of them, and I really appreciate people who send questions, and I would love to read through them and at least understand them. And anybody who wants to reach out to me individually is welcome to my email.
Absolutely, we will do so. So we will share the questions, and if anybody wants to reach out to us to get connected to Dahlia, we are happy to do. Great. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.